Hey fellow fishing fanatic. So you're probably using the wrong length rod for bass fishing, and it's actually costing you fish. Now don't worry, there's a very simple way to figure out which length is best for bass fishing, and that's what we're gonna break down today. There are several factors that go into what makes the best length for bass fishing. Number one, it's personal preference. So if you go out there and you talk to pros, several pros are gonna give you a wide variety. Oh, well, this is the best length and this is the best length. And depending on who you talk to, they're gonna tell you what's the best length based on their personal preferences. A few other things that determine the best length are which lures and presentation you're trying to go with, which ones you're using. That will determine which length is best for you. Where you're fishing, your fishing location, whether you're fishing from the bank, a kayak, or a boat, those all factor into what makes the best rod length. And lastly, how far you want to cast and how accurate you want to cast. You know, a longer rod means you can cast farther, but you're gonna be less accurate, especially at those closer distances. So there's a little bit of give and take to, you know, choosing a long rod and a short rod. But what the heck do I mean by a long rod and a short rod, and what are their benefits, and when should you fish which one? Well, I'm gonna break that down in the rest of the video. So if you found any of this content helpful up to now, I'd appreciate it if you subscribed. That way you can get a lot more content. I mean, we're pumping out videos every week, bass fishing related, fishing related, to help you become a better angler. So if you wanna be a better angler, go ahead and click that subscribe button. My name is Wesley Littlefield with Anglers.com. And when I was younger, I really didn't understand the importance of rod length. You know, I thought they just had different lengths to sell more products. And while this is probably true to an extent, because there's not a lot of difference between a 6'6" rod and a 6'8" rod, there is a reason that they have different lengths. And so I think it's important to understand those so that when you go to buy one, you know which one to get and which one's gonna work best for you. As I mentioned, there are several factors that go into what makes the best rod length. And one of my first considerations is lure and your presentation. Now, generally, if you look at all my rods, pretty much the same length, because I fish from the bank in a kayak 99% of the time. So all my rods are real similar in length, no matter what lure I'm throwing, because of the location. So you've got to remember that all these factors kind of factor in on top of each other, and it comes down to personal preference. But choosing the lure. So which lengths are actually best for which lures? I generally like a little bit shorter rod, meaning, you know, 6.5 foot-ish, somewhere around there, give or take a few inches, for like spinner baits, for jerk baits, and for baits that I'm either gonna be moving a lot, except for crankbaits, we'll talk about that, and baits that I've got to keep that rod tip close to the water. Now I'm shorter, so standing on the bank, I don't need a real long rod to reach close down to the water. And in a kayak, I'm usually sitting down, or even if I'm standing, I'm still short. So I don't need that extra length to keep when I'm jerking a jerk bait. I don't need that rod tip way out there. I'd like it closer to my boat or closer to me on the bank. And so I think it's important to have a little bit shorter rod in those instances. So spinner baits, jerk baits, and then, you know, you can add in a few other baits that are similar to that, like a chatterbait would be an example of that. Now, when I'm throwing crankbaits or lures, even swim baits that I really want to just launch out there, I usually use a longer rod. And here's why. Number one, crankbaits and swim baits typically have bigger, thicker hooks. So it means you need more of a hook set. And that longer rod is gonna give you a little bit of extra leverage, a little bit better hook set. And it helps you with the casting. So I think that, you know, having a longer rod definitely helps launch it out there. Another time that I use a long rod is for top waters. So when I'm launching a buzz bait or I'm launching a frog, I just like a little bit longer rod, because really frog fishing specifically, you know, you're casting typically in some nasty stuff. So I really need to set the hook hard and get that fish out of there, and having that longer rod really helps me fight that fish just a little bit better. And it never hurts to cast that frog just a little bit further away from the boat, especially when you're in the shallows. That boat presence, or, you know, even you walking up along the bank, you have a presence and the fish feel it, and just being able to cast a little bit further helps you get away. The fish aren't aware that you're there, and then you're more likely to get more bites. Speaking of casting distance, let's move on to how the rod length affects the casting distance and accuracy. As I mentioned, longer rods work better if you want to launch it out there. Now I'm talking like 7-foot rods and longer, you set 7.6, 8 foot. All those are great for really getting a long cast out there. So if you're casting like a deep diving crankbait and you really need to get a good long cast, go with 7.5 foot, 8 foot rod, just to launch it way out in the middle of the lake, way out in the middle of the pond, whatever you're fishing. However, when you go with that longer rod, you sacrifice accuracy, especially in close quarters. So while fishing from a kayak, I like to fish real close to the bank most of the time. Obviously the fish aren't always there, so I need to move around, but most of the time I'm fishing close to the bank, and I've used some longer rods, 7 foot, 7.5 foot rods, and I just don't have enough motion when close quarters. And I'm talking, you know, like if it's within 10, 15 yards, I am not accurate at all. I cannot say I want to cast right there with a longer rod. Now with a shorter rod, I can hit that point every single time and nail exactly where I want to cast. So if you want close accuracy, go with a shorter rod, say 6.5 foot, and my grandpa even uses like a 5.5 foot rod. So really short, but they're a lot more accurate, especially when you're flipping docks, for instance, or when you have to put your lure right on this little stump that you see sticking out of the water, and you can nail it every single time with a shorter rod versus a longer rod. Now, obviously that kind of depends on the situation. Once again, if you're flipping and pitching, sometimes it's better to have that longer rod. So once again, it boils down to a little bit of personal preference. The fishing location is another huge factor. So as I mentioned, I'm a bank angler primarily and a kayak angler, and shorter rods are a must in these two situations for me. From a bank, I will fish a lot from a wide open pond like this, but I also like to get where nobody else is going, and that's usually where there's a lot of overhanging trees where it's really hard to get to. So having that little bit shorter rod helps me maneuver the trees a little bit better and helps me cast better and not be getting hung up in a tree overhanging when I've just made a cast here and there's limbs sticking up. So it allows me to fish more and get more cast in, therefore more fish. But when I'm fishing from a boat, I don't typically have those restrictions around me. Now, sometimes in a boat, you know, you might get close to the shore and need to go with a shorter rod, but generally you've got enough room to make a full casting motion that you need for a longer rod. So generally most people, most anglers go with longer rods, 7 foot plus when fishing from a boat. And lastly, we're getting to personal preference. I've hit on it 100 different times today, so I'm not gonna beat a dead horse. Personal preference matters. Some anglers don't like a longer rod, heavier rod, because it just hurts their wrists, it tires them out faster. So if you want to fish longer, most of the time it's better to go with a little bit smaller, shorter rod, a little bit more lightweight. But it boils down to personal preference. Go test out a few different lengths and you'll find that, you know, you generally like one specific length. That length for me is either a 6.5 foot to a 7 foot, maybe a 7.5 foot, but generally 7.5 foot is like my max. I'm not gonna go over that just because I fish from the bank and I fish from a kayak. So I don't need that extra length and I don't want that extra length. Besides all that, my grandpa has caught way more fish than I'll ever think about catching, and he used a 5.5 foot fishing rod from 1970s, 1980s, forever. He still uses it today, and I think that he would have done better had he had the opportunity to, you know, use a longer rod in certain situations. He probably would have caught even more fish, but he still caught a bunch with a super short rod. Too short, in my opinion. I don't like fishing with them, but he uses them and he catches a lot of fish. So it always just boils down to personal preference. Figure out what you want to use and go from there. And now that you know generally where to start and what rod length is best, it's time to figure out what gear ratio is best. That video is down below me right now, where I tell you why the pros are typically lying to you about what is the best gear ratio. So if you want to figure that out, check out the video down below me. And until then, remember that education is important, but fishing is essential.